Okay, thank you. All right, good morning, and all of you welcome to the next workshop seminar session we have on nature-based approaches for sustainable and resilient infrastructure development. I would like the panelists to come on stage. All of you, please. And I would like, yes, we have maybe the next slide, please. Welcome. Yes, anywhere where you feel. Maybe we can have it in order starting from, yeah. Okay. Yes, maybe John, maybe here, then Bresci, Kenneth before Stefan. Yeah, thanks. Yes, before presenting ourselves as the panelists, I would like just to mention that this is a session which will focus on a nature-based solution, nature-based approaches, nature-based adaptation and resilience type of system and approaches, but looking both at sustainability aspects and resilience, adaptation, and disaster climate resilience aspects at the same time. So in that sense, it's going to be a session which is looking at infrastructure and the infrastructure interface with nature-based solutions approaches. Designing will be one of the key elements of the presentation of the panelists, preparation of infrastructure investments, where we look at good practices, requirements, applicability, replicability potentials, as well as how to achieve good performance, which is also one of the key issues when we are actually considering nature-based and green infrastructure type of approaches in preparing or even identifying opportunities for green infrastructure investments. Decision-making systems, also as you hear from one of the presentation, in particular the keynote presentation by John, will actually be on decision-making systems to increase green and green infrastructure investment to become the new normal, hopefully, in the next few years, or maybe half a decade or decade. And developing, designing NBS in the urban water infrastructure is also another area of emphasis we'll have through the presentation and hopefully through the discussion this morning. And lastly, and not least, we'll also hear in particular from Stefan on the experience, in particular project experience, but also policy experience of ADB in supporting green infrastructure and nature-based solutions in particular urban infrastructure investments. So I will start by introducing the panelists, maybe a couple of words on myself to start with. I'm Daniele Ponzi, the chief of the Environment Thematic Group. I've been in ADB for a long time, about 20 years, and I've been covering environment, natural resource management, agriculture, and climate, both adaptation and mitigation, in particular climate risk management in my career. I've been covering both policy and strategy and knowledge management work for green growth, but also projects, both preparation and administration in my career, mainly in the Pacific Department, but also Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the rest of the ADB countries. I will start maybe in order of presentation with John. John Matthews is the executive director and the co-founder of the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, AGWA, and which is hosted by the World Bank and the Stockholm International Water Institute, SIWI. His work blends technical and policy knowledge for climate adaptation and water management with a specific emphasis and attention on the practical, pragmatic aspects of implementation. John's recent efforts have increasingly focused on decision-making frameworks for adapting water infrastructure and ecosystems to climate impacts. John is also Senior Water Fellow at the Colorado State University and the courtesy faculty members of the Water Resource Graduate Program at Oregon State University. He will be giving us the first presentation, the keynote, with a little bit longer time than the others. Second, we'll have Breshi van Wassenbeek. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing properly name and family name, working with Delta Res, and she's an expert in coastal zone management and ecosystem adaptation and nature-based solution, particularly with respect to water infrastructure investments. She's a nature-based flood risk mitigation expert. Specialty includes ecosystem function in flood risk mitigation projects. She has been part of the number of DRR, disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction projects, including green measures in the Philippines and Colombia and South America. And she's working on implementation of soft and hybrid engineered measures in the field in Indonesia. She initiated and largely contributed and wrote a set of guidelines for nature-based flood protection, which is supported by 25 organizations and has been published by the World Bank. She's affiliated with the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, and has been working there on knowledge base for practical application on nature-based flood risk reduction measures in close collaboration with the civil engineers. Next, we have Julia Nebrija. She is the program manager for a program called Assistance to Cities in the Department of the Budget Management in this country, in the Philippines. She's an urban planner, passionately focusing her efforts on making cities livable, but also more lovable places. And I like this line. She has worked on with nonprofits, international organizations, and government agencies, in particular in the Philippines, with the same goal of developing sustainable solutions to urban challenges. Most recently, she served as the Assistant General Manager of Operation for the Metropolitan Manila Development Agency, MMDA, this is known here in the Philippines, before joining the Department of Budget Management as the Program Manager for Special Technical Review Unit in the Office of the Secretary. She draws inspiration from biking around the streets of Metro Manila, exploring the Pasig River, and collaborating on projects with the creative communities in historic Manila. Next, we have Kenneth Kuoth with Arup Hong Kong as director. As you know, Arup is international, is a multinational engineering firm, and Kenneth has got more than 20 years international experience in project and design management of a variety of planning and engineering infrastructure projects in Hong Kong, in China, and also across other countries in East Asia and also United Kingdom. He specializes in the delivery of integrated water management solutions around the water cycle and has led study teams to deliver water infrastructure for major new towns developing in Hong Kong. Kenneth's experience also includes working with the teams of international experts on climate change resilience work in Ho Chi Minh City and here in Metro Manila. Then we have, as a last speaker, not the least, Stefan Rao, our colleague here in ADB, Senior Urban Development Specialist with the East Asia Department covering Mongolia and China. His work focuses on preparing and implementing, administering urban, environmental, and economic development projects and technical assistance programs. As I said, mainly covering now China and Mongolia. And his main focus currently is in the planning and the implementation of projects for livable, inclusive, competitive, and environmental sustainable cities. Quite a long agenda. Prior to ADB, he has worked as urban planning consultant supporting master planning and policy development for public and private clients in the United States, PRC, and various other European and Asian countries. So I'll stop here, clap for the panelists. And then I would call John for the keynote. And possibly you can use this mic. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm very honored and happy to be here. It's my second trip to the ADB, first time at this forum. And I've so far found it a really interesting meeting. I'd like to be a little bit provocative to spark a good conversation. I'm a freshwater ecologist by training. I've worked in maybe 30 countries around the world on especially sustainable freshwater resources management, climate change, climate adaptation. And I'd like to start off with kind of a challenge. We've been talking about nature-based solutions using different terms for something like 30 years. And I don't feel like we have a lot to show for it. And I want to know why. I want to know what have been those obstacles. And I'd like to challenge you as the audience on that particular issue. And part of it, I want to suggest with this idea that nature has kind of existed between the lines, between the way we've divided up sectors and institutions and disciplines and investments. And that we actually need to bridge some of those gaps in new ways to actually go from thinking just about individual projects to thinking about whole programs. So just a quick word about AGUA. We're a global network. We have a small secretariat, but it's a global network mostly of water professionals that are interested in how to mainstream resilience perspectives into water resources management, trying to think very holistically, especially about a new knowledge synthesis around climate adaptation, a little bit on mitigation, and we have a lot of resources. We're very active as groups of individuals. We do some policy work too. In the UNFCCC, we represent the water sector, for instance. So what are our goals for nature-based solutions? There have been lots of terms that have been used over the years for nature-based solutions. I like NBS as a term. But I'd say that if we were to really try to go mainstream, then we need to be able to make green and hybrid solutions something that's very credible. And that's kind of the key word to my mind. How do we make them credible to specific sectors? Thinking about agriculture, water, energy, cities, transport. And I would say that a really important obstacle that we've seen is mostly we've talked about accumulating evidence. We kind of confront people in those sectors and say, why aren't you doing this? Here are these lovely case studies that we put together, and you just need to change what you've been doing and deploy these examples. And I think part of that is that we've often been stuck mostly talking to environment ministries. It's not that environment ministries are useless. I'm not saying that at all. But they're our home team. You know, and we need to get out of the environment ministry, move beyond them. They're an ally, but we need to be able to work with other ministries, with other sectors, other groups. So the environment ministry, important partner, but insufficient in themselves. And I think in order to relate to those sectors, we need to think about how we make decisions within those sectors and where maybe there's room for how we engage on nature-based solutions. Also, I think we treat nature-based solutions as almost its own kind of agenda. Instead of trying to really embed it, even in many cases, need to subsume it in other types of agendas. Just a few that I think are really key ones: cities, agriculture, DRR, so disaster risk reduction, and certainly climate adaptation. And I'm going to talk, especially in the context of this conference, a lot about climate change issues because it's new for many institutions, and because it's new, it represents a different set of inroads and how we engage in these topics. So, and I also think we need to think very specifically about nature-based solutions and its particular alignment within different sectors. We may come up with very different approaches for transport versus agriculture. And lastly, I want to make sure that we talk about nature-based solutions as an economic asset. We need to get it from just talking about something that's in the environment sector or, again, the environment ministry, to saying that this actually has a tangible benefit to economies. The first example I want to show is around decision support systems. Decision support systems are a really good way to kind of mainstream existing decision-making processes and bring up new issues. You have, in effect, a consistent and systematic approach. It's not thinking about individual projects. It's not thinking about particular individuals. It's thinking about how an institution works. This is a publication that's coming out next Tuesday that Agua has played a key role in developing. It's being published by UNESCO. And it's based on an interesting assumption. Most of the water management decisions that we make globally essentially follow the same 5 or 6 steps. It's consistent. It doesn't matter if you're talking about South Africa, Vietnam, Poland, the United States. It doesn't matter. It's all those same steps. So where do we think about climate change in those steps? That's what this publication is focused on. And it also reflects on a topic that I've heard a lot over the last day, which is looking at bottom-up approaches. I've been really encouraged by the number of presentations and interventions, also from the floor, talking about the importance about how we need to actually bring in a lot of stakeholders at the beginning of a process together, maybe with a kind of key hosting institution, develop a very clear problem and need, develop a whole basket of solutions that then we go to the decision maker. And that they may make a decision, a final selection of the particular choice based on cost or efficacy or other kind of institutional approval processes that are different than the stakeholders, but the stakeholders have been very involved from the beginning of the process. So that's really elemental, and it's where a lot of water management institutions are starting to see a big shift in how they operate on a daily basis. So in practice, this particular project, it's called CRIDA or CRIDA, Climate Risk Informed Decision Analysis. It begins with developing a shared vision with stakeholders and decision makers, and then it develops 2 basic types of solutions from a climate risk perspective. First, it thinks about a robust solution across a credible set of climate risks. How can we be really comprehensive? But there's so much uncertainty related to the water cycle, to water management, especially the kind of long timescales that we need to think about with water, that uncertainty and flexibility are really key issues that we need to be able to mainstream. So we also developed a set of flexible solutions. And what we did inside of CRIDA 2 was we recognized, especially for flexible solutions, nature-based solutions were probably at their strong point. They actually had a lot to be able to value from a flexibility perspective. And so we needed to include eco-hydrological systems and green infrastructure development right at the beginning of the process. In fact, we even talk in CRIDA about how to view ecosystems as a stakeholder themselves in that early decision-making process. So the CRIDA it's not a green infrastructure development guide in the headlines, but it is a green infrastructure development guide in practice. And I think that that actually is a very important lesson about how we move to be able to engage and persuade and really develop a long-term buy-in. And in this case, we used a decision support system. Second example is trying to integrate more broadly with climate adaptation programs. This is a quick case study. So Mexico, over the past few years, has been very worried about climate impacts. Parts of the country are very water scarce, parts of the country have a lot of water. But flooding and drought are actually increasing problems. They have a big issue with hurricanes, typhoons as well, in much of the country. And the country recognizes that water is essentially its strategic asset. And so they placed it at the center of their national climate adaptation program. In the Americas, North and South America, Mexico is probably the most progressive country in climate adaptation, period. It's a very interesting country from that perspective. So working with the National Water Commission, working with WWF, the Inter-American Development Bank, and UNESCO, we developed a program that's called Water Reserves. We rolled it out with about 300 basins to begin with this past year. Now, Water Reserve actually recognizes the fundamental role that ecosystems play in terms of their adaptation services for all of the water users, all the water sectors in each basins. But how do you determine exactly what those ecological needs are to provide those adaptation services? And that's where we developed with these other partners a process to be able to define the kind of breaking point, the management guidelines for each basin to be able to determine where is the operating safe space, where is our climate adaptation decision-making space in each basin. In this particular basin, this is in the northwestern part of the country, we determined that ecological drought was the kind of key management indicator that we needed to work with. There's a number of cases. This method has been applied already in South America, and the Inter-American Development Bank is rolling it out in 5 other countries across Latin America and the Caribbean over the next 2 years. The third area is trying to think more broadly, not just for public sector institutions or NGOs, but how do we make sure that we think about private investment too, that we think much more collectively, we draw the circle of interested parties more broadly. And there we need to think about investors. And we haven't seen that much investment really in terms of green solutions, about green infrastructure, hybrid solutions. Why is that? One of the issues clearly is that if you're an investor, this is being advertised as a green solution. You don't know if it's a good one or a bad one. There literally are articles in the investor press that say, how green is it? It's a fundamental issue. They don't understand ecosystems, but they see it potentially as an emerging market. Well, China has actually really seized in this area, particularly in the area of green and climate bonds. Green bonds, climate bonds did not exist in China before about 3 years ago. And they have exploded. China is now the second largest green bond market in the world. What are green bonds? They're really loans, almost invariably for infrastructure. And China has been, so far, until very, very recently, has kept the green and climate bond market largely an internal domestic market. You had to be inside the country to buy them. It was mostly focused on these internal investors. And very noticeably, they didn't have a lot of criteria to be able to evaluate, again, good from bad. And the government has seen that as actually a systemic risk. You can see that water, in particular, plays a significant part of this market in China. And if you think that all the water that's embedded in waste management, low carbon transport, energy, and adaptation in agriculture, actually almost all of the green and climate bond market in China is actually water related. Here's the spectacular growth. The dark blue and orange components represent China. There was almost nothing in 2015, and we're already setting a new record in 2017. So far last year, almost 40 billion. just behind the US. Almost done. As long as we can go to the next slide. There. So Agua, with a consortium of other groups, put together a set of criteria to be able to evaluate, to be able to communicate between the people who are issuing these green bonds and the people who want to buy them, to be able to look at their, for water-intensive investments, the climate resilience quality of these. So far, around 2 billion US have actually been evaluated against these criteria globally. And the most recent issuance actually came in China. It's around a $200 million investment. And what I think is very interesting is the Chinese government has actually decided to adopt these criteria as a kind of standard component for all of their domestic issuances in the coming years. So they'll be meeting an international standard. They're also breaking open their bonds market. There's some additional information on these criteria published through these sources. Lastly, I just want to end with kind of a big thought, a really interesting reflection I heard about a year and a half ago at an internal World Bank meeting. It was a senior manager. The World Bank's water portfolio alone is around 27 billion US. They spend a lot on water. He stood up, just talking to his colleagues and me. He said, "We build things that last 300 years. Why don't we think about sustainability for that long?" To me, that's the opening that we really need to move things from an environmental realm into the economic. Thank you.
We have now the second presentation, Brashik. Please come, if you want to present from there or here.
Thank you, Daniele. I'm glad to be here, everyone. Everywhere I work across the world, people tell me we're not sure if nature-based solutions will work when I start talking about nature-based solutions. And I think that's interesting because I think as soon as we start building, we will sometimes fail, right? If we look at gray engineering, I see gray engineering fail all over the world all the time. And I put up some pictures, but you see roads collapsing. As soon as we start building in rivers and we try to divert streams, it's going to be really complex. And sometimes with gray engineering, you also have to come back every year to do maintenance or to reconstruct. However, I think as a nature-based community, we need to realize that we will be put to different standards. And we have to live up to that because somehow we have to come up with more credibility because it's a gray engineering world, I think. So I think there's 3 challenges for us to do to implement nature-based solutions well. So the first one, John already sort of touched upon it, is how to plan nature-based solutions well, right? Actually, I have to say those challenges also count for gray engineering solutions. Because the better we plan, the less we will fail. So the more time actually we spend before implementing and constructing a project on the ground, the more time we spend in getting to know our system, in obtaining data, the less likely the chances that our project will fail. Then we need to learn better how to design, how to construct, and how to maintain nature-based solutions well, and how to scale up. How to scale up these solutions to scales that are significant, to scales where natural processes are at work, and to ecosystem or landscape scales. I included the 5 principles that are in the guidelines that we wrote together with a big group of stakeholders, and the guidelines contain process steps, but also principles, and they're very high level, but they are meant to improve implementation of nature-based infrastructure. Some of these principles, you could actually say we can adhere and integrate nature-based into existing engineering frameworks, but for some, I think we also can challenge engineering a little bit to maybe change the current engineering paradigm. So for example, the first one, I think for sometimes in engineering, a too small scale is being taken. So we've said for good engineering and for good implementation of nature-based solutions, you need to take a system scale perspective, which means, I pull a picture that is with another of these criteria. It means we need to be starting considering not like a river bend, but we need to start considering a full river system from the mountain up to the coast. If we work on coast, we need to look at the river because our sediment that feeds our coastline comes from the river. If we do an upstream measure, that will influence our downstream peak flow. So I think we will make most progress with nature-based solutions if we're able to start looking on a larger system scale. And this also includes taking a larger time frame in the way we design. Further, we need to do a risk and benefit assessment. Just like we do for gray solutions, we need to do a risk assessment before we do a nature-based solution. And here it differs from a gray solution is nature-based solutions, unlike engineering solutions, will derive multiple benefits, right? If I implement a wetland for flood protection, it will also give me water purification, for example, recreational value. That is where nature-based solutions really distinguish themselves from gray engineering solutions. So to better compare them with gray engineering solutions, we need to start accounting for benefits more than we do now in the current cost-benefit analysis framework. Further, we need standardized performance evaluation of nature-based solutions. And here I think we can adhere to the current engineering standards. And we do that because we feel we can test ecosystems in a similar ways as we test engineering structures, right? We can look at their performance, we can look at design criteria. As an engineer looks at the levee, we can look at the mangrove forest under 1,000 waves, how much wave reduction does it achieve? Thereby, I can design the levee behind it, so and reduce the crest height of the levee by integrating the mangrove. So we can already do this partly, but I think we're actively working with scientists across the world to do this better for ecosystems and to quantify their functions in engineering ways. I think it's very important we integrate implementation of nature-based solutions with ecosystem conservation and restoration. That's a field that's already out there. It contains a whole lot of work. There are textbooks on ecosystem restoration, so please make use of it. And then most importantly, I think we need to do adaptive management. You need to do that for engineering solutions too. If you're meaning to implement an infrastructure intervention and you're meaning to never return to that site, I think just not do it. Maintenance need to be included and operation need to be included in your budget. So come back, monitor if performance meets your target, and then if it doesn't, adapt. This way you will keep your infrastructure up to date, but you will also learn. And otherwise, we're not learning. And then everything I think we do is sort of in vain. So how to scale up nature-based solutions? I think that's another challenge we're facing. So we see many interventions that are implemented very small scale, right? If you put a reef ball in, how are we ever going to scale that up to saving coral reefs? This is a project we do in Indonesia. We implement these permeable dams, and the aim is to focus on improving abiotic conditions for mangrove recruitment in eroding coastlines. And the dams mitigate or attenuate waves, sediment is accreted behind it, and then we do not plant mangroves, but as you see here, the natural species that starts first, you call it api-api, I think, in Asia, it colonizes itself. Even with this approach, before implementing it, we did actually a sort of coastal zone management study looking at the area. We did a system analysis and we thought, can we scale this up? And we scaled it up like this. So this is on a landscape scale. The lines you see are the dams. And even I have to be honest about this, even if I think we tried to do the process right, we had little data in this area and this area is subsiding more than we thought. So it's very difficult to maintain our structures to accrete enough sediment to get mangroves back. But I think this approach is intermediate upscalable. However, if we talk about reef restoration, for example, I think what will be upscalable is not the reef wall, but it is focusing on your abiotic conditions. So making your boundary conditions right. So that means take care that the water is clean, right? Put in a sanitation plan for water. Those are not the most popular measures, but those measures can save reefs on large scales. So those are the important measures. So to me, the answers are in nature-based solutions need to be integrated in existing frameworks. To get it right, we also need to get our engineering right. They need to go hand in hand. To work at larger landscape scales and long-term management and decision-making. To work together, that's an important one. Engineers and ecologists need to work together to do nature-based solutions well. And for me, also very important is for policymakers, do not fear the unpopular measures. I know it's nice to cut a ribbon or plant a mangrove, but implementing a water sanitation plant and a water resource management framework and a water management plan can sometimes be more effective. Thank you.
Okay, we have now Julia, who will talk to us about her Assistance to Cities current program and how she's doing green spaces with climate resilience also in mind. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'll just jump into what the Department of Budget and Management is doing. This year, the Secretary Giocno wanted to allocate something that would be complementary to the Build, Build, Build initiative, which is a massive infrastructure program of the Philippines. So we decided on the green, green, green. So linked to the Build, Build, Build. Sorry, I don't know why the slides are jumping like that. So what we focused on was primarily when the Secretary was looking at what do we want to invest on cities, it's everything between the buildings, because right now we're building a lot of infrastructure, but how about the places where people can just enjoy on a daily basis? And we're looking at those public spaces that really are not invested on right now in the cities that you see across the Philippines. Sorry, can I get, not, am I gonna do it or are you gonna do it? Yeah, yeah. Is it just jumping or? Okay. Should I not? I'm not pressing this one. Okay. Can we go to the first slides? So if you've had a chance to be in Metro Manila, you know that the planning systems in the Philippines are a little bit, it's a bit challenging to plan at a regional scale, especially we talk about nature-based solutions. In the case of Metro Manila, we have 17 cities and they all plan primarily individually. So in this case, we are facing a couple of challenges. We are working with 145 cities and we're working directly with the local government units. So a fund was allocated, the total is 2.5 billion pesos, it's about $50 million for this year. And that was pre-allocated based on a formula, 50% based on land area and 50% based on population. So we were able to, that was pre-allocated for the 145 cities. We don't have a building standard outside of the National Building Code, which touches mostly gray infrastructure. So that is another one of the challenges. We also don't have standards for instance, urban design. We have comprehensive land use planning guidelines, but those are again adopted at the local government level. So when you talk about green, have we qualified what it means to be green? Do we have a definition for even public space? Those are things that we're still working on. So this fund is basically, it's a catalyst to start this conversation with the cities, but having a financial incentive to also build projects out over the next several years of the administration. So I'm not sure if I can try to show you this now. Okay. So far, we are almost finished. Oh gosh. Okay. So far, we don't have the full 143 proposals, but of the ones that we do have, we're seeing interesting, so streetscapes, so transforming a lot of streets, fixing sidewalks, putting bike lanes, planting trees, just the very, very basics of what would make a nice street. The majority of public open space in any city is a street. Of course, we're looking at parks. Not every city has space to do a new park, but we're having some creative solutions, reclaiming areas that were formerly plazas that are now parking lots, turning them back into parklets. We're looking also at plazas, which is a typology which was inherited during Spanish colonialization. So a lot of plaza spaces that used to exist that were now like dumping areas or run over by different functions are being reclaimed and restored. We also have waterfronts, of course, like a delta. We are an island nation, so all of the cities somehow are surrounded by water at some point, whether it's a small creek, a large river, or a bay. In the case of Metro Manila, we're surrounded by 2 bays and bisected by a river. So we're looking also at reclaiming waterfront spaces. And even we have some submissions for the mangrove parks. So putting in boardwalks into mangroves that will help on educational exposure at the same time of preserving the landscape. So just to give you a quick idea, based on the local standards, we have minimums. So again, it's about, we end up planning on minimums. So as opposed to having the design standards or anything, it's about a minimum amount of space per 1,000 population. And so if we measure on that, the few cities have less than the 75,000 square meters of open space that's mandated. Most cities have more than 75,000 because this is nationwide. So this is some of the cities outside of Metro Manila that aren't yet heavily built up. But if we look at a WHO standard, which is that there should be 9 square meters of space per person, right? Then you start to see that number flips, and most cities actually have less than the mandated amount of open space. So right now, based on the 66 proposals that we have reviewed to date of the 143, we're looking at an average increase of 2.65% in public open space across the cities, serving an average of 55,000 people per project within a 10-meter walking radius. So this is also the first time that we are collecting this data nationwide. It's the first time cities are required to even report this kind of data in any of the planning process. So if we can go to the next set, I'll just quickly show some examples. Another challenge that I would like to highlight is that in the Philippines, we have only 460 licensed landscape architects for a country of more than 100 million people. We have 4,300 licensed environmental planners, which is the only type of certification you can get for urban. So we have one graduate program for urban design, for urban development and planning in the country. So these are some of the technical capacities that we are facing. Most cities have an engineer, but again, that's primarily led into gray infrastructure. So integrating the nature-based solutions is something that's very, very preliminary as we're working directly with the local government units at this time. So just to give you a very quick, this is one example from San Jose del Monte. So the big myth in the Philippines is that there's no more space. There's no more space in the Philippines. We can't possibly do public open space anywhere. So it's interesting. We've come up with, some of the cities have proposed, like this is a track oval. So of course, a track oval is only used at a certain time of day, so many times a week. So how about transforming the rest of the space, put your amphitheater there, put your park, and we're just trying to green that area that's already, it can be a center of civic life located in the poblacion and putting that closer to where people actually are. This was a park. This was formerly a plaza, is now a parking lot. We'll reclaim it back into a plaza. These are very simple interventions, 4 million pesos. That's nothing, really, and it's just putting in trees. The planter boxes are the seating around the trees, restoring the form. There's an elementary school there. There was a stage, putting in a crosswalk, opening up the entrance to link to the commercial center across the street. So basic interventions. This one is in Caloocan City. This is a former retention pond that is overgrown and heavily silted. So they wanted to originally dig it out and make it into a lagoon by cementing it and pumping in water. And we said, if it was originally a retention pond, let's put it back. Let's figure out how to collect rainwater again there. And then they're primarily planting indigenous flora and fauna to make it this true Filipino nature park. Bioswales is something that we're looking into. There's no standard for that yet, but we're trying to do simple rain gardens and bioswales in some of the projects. This is in Catalogan. In Davao City, which is one of the highest allocations, 123 million, they have 3 parks. So again, turning underutilized lots that aren't, nothing's really being done with them yet. And instead of, developing them into buildings, they are choosing to keep them open, and we're working with them on some of the design to improve them as park spaces that also connect into the fabric of the city. In Iligan, this is the first example that we have of a proposed wet park. This is inspired by the Rotterdam plazas that you see coming out of the Netherlands that have been now implemented in a lot of other countries. It's an area in front of the city hall that floods, and they're thinking of how to use them as retention ponds during rainy season, while at the same time recreational facilities when it's not raining. However, we're needing a lot more engineering assistance on this one to make sure that it's going to work. So that's kind of the quick overview. I think I talked about some of the challenges that we're facing. This is definitely a preliminary effort, but we are coordinating with a lot of other national agencies. Like John mentioned, we have to work with the Climate Change Commission, the Department of Environment, Natural Resources, the Department of Public Works and Highways, the Department of Transportation. This is a conversation that we're just starting, so we look forward to seeing how this community can help us also move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. This is very interesting presentation, particularly with the examples as well of what has already been done in some of the cities here in the Philippines. So we'll have now the next presentation with Kenneth Kuok. Thanks.
Thank you. Very delighted to be here to share with you the story about the sponge city in China and how it contributes to the water resilience. So obviously it's a very big topic, and I'm in my next 8 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the sponge city initiative and its implementation, and followed by a case study. So first of all, China is a very big country. Unfortunately, that makes the country has a lot of severe water problems, both in terms of its flooding problem, water quality issues, as well as water scarcity issues. The country has quite uneven rainfall distribution. As you can see, it's quite wet in the south and quite dry in the north. However, flooding does occur across the country, no matter it's wet or dry. According to a research recently done by the Global Resilience Partnership, actually in the past 20 years, more than 2.5 billion people in China, which is a staggering number, has been affected by flooding in one form or the other. And actually, flooding causes more damage and economic and social damage than any other natural disaster in China. So for instance, in year 2012, the big flooding in Beijing has caused a lot of damage to the city. It killed almost 80 people, damaged more than 8,200 homes, and result in a financial loss of something like more than 1.6 billion US dollars. On the other hand, drought is also a problem, mainly in the northern areas, as China government has already implemented quite a lot of raw water transfer scheme from the south to the north, and they are major engineering scheme. Now, China is experiencing unprecedented urban expansion since the 80s. Though population recently has slowed down in terms of its growth, but then there's still a strong movement of people moving from the rural to urban areas. So as you can see, it is predicted in year 2030, some 70% of its population, amounting 1.3 to 1.4 billion, would live in urban areas. That is in about 10 years' time. And that will definitely bring a lot of stresses on the urban water systems. Actually, it's also predicted 25 out of 100 of the world's biggest cities will be in China. So to add to the problem is the impact of climate change, which we all know will bring shocks and stresses to our water systems, making drought and flooding more frequent, and also worse. Now, the sponge city concept, in a certain sense, is not new. We've all heard about the sustainable drainage system, water-sensitive urban design in Singapore with the ABC program. So the concept itself is not new. Now, it was first put forward by President Xi in 2013, and the pilot sponge city program was launched in end 2014. The general objective really is to restore the city's capacity to absorb, to retain, and to release the water in a controlled manner. In a sense, they try to mimic the natural hydrological cycle, and sponge city will help to tackle the urban surface water flooding situation and the related urban water problem, such as the purification of the runoff, the attenuation of the peak flow, as well as water conservation. It will help to mainstream the flood risk management and water conservation into the urban planning. Now, green infrastructure together with natural-based solutions will very much complement the existing hard infrastructure solutions. And actually quite ambitious, we have to say, target have been set by the central government. So by year 2020, which is not far away, now 20% of the urban areas should be able to locally store, infiltrate, and then reuse 70% of the rainfall that land on the site. And then in another 10 years' time, by 2030, this percentage of retention, infiltration, and reuse will go up from 20% to 80%, which is a quite big number in my opinion. Now, in year 2015, initially 16 pilot cities has been selected for as pilot sponge cities. And this was followed by an additional 14 second batch cities. Now, the second batch include actually some of the biggest cities in China, including its capital in Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, and Shenzhen. Interestingly, to kick this off, to drive this initiative, the central government is providing financial support, though not all of it. It is providing some 20-ish direct funding to the cities, to these pilot cities, and the rest of the investment funding are expected to be come up by the city government itself, as well as private financing and funding. Like a sponge, really. So there are 6 critical elements in a sponge city. Rainwater should be able to infiltrate into the ground. The rainwater runoff would be slowed down and retained on site. It will be put into storage for reuse. It will be techniques to purify the runoff, to remove the nutrients and the pollutants, and the water store will be harvested mainly for non-potable water supply. And then at the end, if anything that is excess, it will be released back to the receiving water bodies. It is, I think the concept is really to make use and create blue-green space in the urban city environment, such that it serves multiple purposes and help with the urban management. So the idea is to enhance the urban ecosystem as well as creating more attractive, livable space for people to live in and for people to work in. I want to just quickly show you a case study of one of the projects we've done in Beijing next to the Yongding River. It's a mixed-use development. The site area is about 156 hectares. And here is a quick snapshot of the sponge city strategies that we propose. So the rainfall that land on the roof, land on the roads, land on the site external areas will be treated by a number of sponge city strategies, things like green roof, rainwater harvesting, rain garden, porous pavement, and swales will be implemented across the site. The main objective is for small rainfall events, so most of this water will be retained on site, they will be stored, and they will be promoted for ground infiltration. And when there is a medium to larger rainfall event. This rainfall, whatever is assessed cannot be stored, infiltrate, would then be diverted to the on-site storage, detention storage, where it would be controlled, released to the municipal drain or rivers. The stage flood detention we propose kind of cater for different rainstorm events so that they are more resilient. And the landscaping area surrounding was designed to serve as a flood protection, flood storage function so that they may remain dry normally and then they become flood storage in wet weather conditions. So just to conclude, the Sponge City initiative kind of brings together a couple of the water cycle management strategies. In China's case, it's more focused on flooding and water supply, and it will bring multiple benefits to the community and build resilience. And then I think as we see, there's a lot of case study that the natural-based solution has played a big part in building this resilience as part of the Sponge City implementation. Thank you.
We have now the last speaker, Stefan Rao, who is going to talk about ADB project experience in using nature-based solutions.
Thank you, Daniele. Good morning. I think there's not much left to say after these excellent presentations. So I thank you and Daniele for arranging this so nicely. So I'm left with showing a few nice pictures. I think I want to just drive home a few points, and I'll give you 10 suggestions. I think the key point is that green is good and valuable. John mentioned it already, and it is actually infrastructure, and it gives you economic benefit, and it's infrastructure. And I think particularly in China, where we have engineers at the helm of the government, they do understand that. And I think there's really a shift in, if you can make the next slide, please. Oh, we cannot see the pictures. No, but there are some pictures we cannot see. Okay. If you go back to the first one. One back. And I think we are doing, also with ADB, we're supporting governments across our development member countries, but mainly on a smaller scale. And I think some of the previous speakers have alluded to this also, and I think we do have to scale up. I think it's important to do these small scale projects, but we really have to look at watersheds and to make really an impact. So the first point I want to make, of course, every green open space as green infrastructure is value everywhere. So it's in the cities, in the suburbs, in peri-urban areas, and rural areas. And I show you some pictures of a pilot. It's one of the pilot sponge cities, and it's also one of the pilot urban adaptation cities in Changde. It was on the map from that Kenneth just showed, the city of Changde, and we are supporting Changde as a pilot city in our Technical Assistance Project on Urban Climate Change Adaptation Action Plan mainstreaming in the PRC. Next, please. Actually, they have done really quite amazing. One more back. Infrastructure pieces already. They have great riverfront parks. They opened up a city mode, and they have earth filters along a river and clean the rainwater and so forth. So really following the Sponge City principles that were just alluded to by Kenneth. Of course, we know that green is great for people, animals, and plants, and as long as we keep it diverse, we will have great benefits. So this is a picture of a biodiversity and habitat assessment that we were doing for this project in Jiangxi, Pingxiang. Jiangxi province is one of the provinces that receives a lot of rainwater and also contributes to the Yangtze River system. Next, please. So we talk about green and gray infrastructure, and I think the key message should be whenever we can do green, we should do green. And in the city, of course, we have limited space. Then we have to do away with gray. And I think it was also mentioned already earlier. I think we should integrate gray and green systemically. That means when we do hydraulic and hydrological modeling, we should model and simulate the green and the gray infrastructure together so that they can work as a system. So these images show existing conditions also in this Jiangxi Pingshan area where we already have some gray embankments, but still also a lot of green river edges. Next, please. Next slide. So what we have done also in this Jiangxi Pingshan project, we have sort of developed a process sort of where we used engineering principles, but then later applied green infrastructure design. You can see here the process and the layering of all this. So rivers need space. I think that's also a basic message. When we have the opportunity for new planning, I think we should give rivers enough space, and they, of course, provide ideal backbones for urban park systems. So this, yeah, okay. And I think the basic message that came from all of us already, I think if we do well-planned green space, it will do also the resilience work, and it's basically for free. So if this is a picture of already implemented parks, a wetland park and a river edge, a green river edge in this Pingshan project in 2 of the counties that we serve. And the top left picture shows this wetland in action. When we were there last year, it was actually just a storm was happening, and we can see that the wetland was just filling up, and then a little bit later it would just dry down a little. And then, of course, as also mentioned earlier, we make it accessible with boardwalks and sort of low-lying parkland, so people can also enjoy it in the urban areas. So I think that's also adding to the value of infrastructure. It's actually also money in your pocket for land value increase. Green is gold. Next, please. We of course now have the benefit that more readily available methods and data are there to analyze climate-related risks, and then including through hydrological and hydraulic modeling. So this is show of the climate risk and vulnerability that we have done for this project, and I think we have here great support from Xianfu Lu and Charles Roger, who's also here, who helped supervising this effort. So I think this shows that our local interventions really need to be considered in a larger scale. And you can see that even in the medium scenario, there's a quite significant increase in precipitation here for Pingshan. Of course, we also then have real-time data for gauges in the river where we can calibrate our models. Next, please. So this is the whole territory of the municipality of Pingshan, and we see the river system and the topography overlaid with the urban system and the project concept that we had for our rural-urban integration. So the key message is that upstream places should limit downstream flood and drought risk. So, and therefore, I think maybe we could promote rural-urban flood and drought risk partnerships. So the idea here that we put forward is that in the upstream county cities where we have our interventions, we should talk to the farmers and adapt a lower flood standard, so that in a heavy storm event, the farm field could be flooded, and then for the benefit of a better protection of downstream towns and villages. And we're still working on institutional mechanisms to support that. Next, please. So I'm getting bigger and bigger in scale because that will be my last point. So flooding is a watershed-wide issue to be addressed on that large scale. You can see the blue dot is the location of Pingshan in between 2 main river systems, the Xiang River on the west side and the Gan River system on the east side, both flowing from south to north into the Yangtze River. And at the bottom picture, you see the Yangtze River basin and also this dot. And you can see this dot where Pingshan is gets a lot of the rainwater and sort of also contribute to these big floods in the big cities downstream. So if we can upstream do more to retain and detain water, I think it will benefit the whole system. Next, please. So this is the same message. This is just a picture where this was done in Germany, in Bavaria, in an upstream or in a tributary system to the Danube, where a big river was renaturalized. You can see the bottom right. They channelized it and then they renaturalized it. They traced the old system and then they built a big overflow system and a lake. So in case of really big storm events that happened also recently in Germany, the Danube River flooding will be less. Next, please. So we're talking about green and gray. Again, I think in the cities we have to do both. So I think it's really a matter of scale. So we have to integrate gray and greens systemically in city, but in the metropolitan and city cluster or even country scale, we really should work with green and should promote that. Next, please. So in the case of China, maybe you have heard of this initiative of the 13th Five-Year Plan, and even previously since 2006, where they promote city cluster development, so coordinating cities in the same territory to work more effectively and efficiently together. You can see the top left picture shows how they play out sort of in this 4,000 kilometer north-south extended coastal area. And I think what's really necessary is to balance this with a system of large-scale open spaces. And those large-scale open spaces would do all kinds of benefits, including resilience along coastlines and rivers. And I think this should be proposed to the Chinese government as a system of national parks. So it would not only do resilience work, it would also provide sort of a two speeds of development. You have the high speed in the city, and then that provides a lifestyle, and then to counterbalance that, you have a slower speed in the countryside, and also in the maybe rural areas within the metropolitan agglomerations, and this way you also have equal benefits. So I did this plan in 2011, and I think now we're allowed to present it to the Chinese government. Thank you.
All right, thanks to all the speakers for the excellent presentation. We've been hearing a lot about the need to integrate, the need to go for green, gray, and often green and gray combined through integrated approaches to actually achieve the intended objectives of the various investment programs. And we've been hearing perhaps the most important thing is the risk and the benefits that arise out of green, nature-based type of approaches and investments. And in particular, one of the slides, and it was mentioned by Bresci about, for example, the nature-based approaches that consider wetlands, either new or restoration of wetlands, where you have pollution control and water quality improvement benefits beside the flood risk and climate disaster resilience type of benefit stream. So the benefits and the flexibility that nature-based solutions can provide are really an important element taken in consideration when identifying and developing nature-based solutions. I think that we have seen from the presentation a number of issues. I would like to have now questions from the floor. We have about 15 minutes perhaps for discussion, and possibly to go a little bit deeper, some of the criteria and some of the methods and some of the examples, especially from the last couple of presentations, in particular in the context of China, that we can have maybe a little bit more discussion. Yes, please, the first question down there. Thanks. We have enough microphone here? Yes. Yes, please.
Good morning. My name is Jessica Dator Bercilia. I'm from Christian Aid. It's an NGO working with communities, but at the same time, we engage with private sector and local governments, the National Resilience Council, for example, of the Philippines. Amazing presentations, but what I'm thinking while you were presenting was that a lot of these are cost intensive, very cost intensive, and the thinking is that the paradigm is that the responsibility to address resilience falls heavily on the government, for governments and those who have that resource. I was wondering whether in parallel to what you have already presented, is there in any of your approaches, is there an embedded strategy where local communities can actually take part and contribute, because you can actually give the project to just one contractor and do it all at the same time. That speeds up things. But the other alternative is to have each of us do it all at the same time. Okay, that's also scaling it up. But the problem, I think my question is, are there projects that will help give back that capacity to local communities to act and empower themselves so that they can contribute to those issues?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I think that green and nature-based solutions lend themselves much more than gray type of concrete hard engineering investments to exactly the approach that you are advocating. So anybody who would like to maybe give an example of maybe local community participation and also inputs into design, maybe even in the maintenance of these schemes. Bresci, would like to start?
Yeah, I would like to refer to our Indonesia project that I showed 2 slides of. There we have the dam, so we hire a contractor to do the dams, but he hires the local community for construction. And also we now, just last June, we transferred all the dams to the community in an official ceremony. So they will do the maintenance, and we've implemented a sort of revolving funding mechanism. If you Google for biorights and Wetlands International, you can find it. And the biorights mechanism, so that they can do maintenance of the dams. They will also, they are also discussing to keep part, so they give back some ponds and revert it to mangrove. And the bioright helps them then to establish an alternative livelihood. And the other thing we did there, which I was really charmed of, is a coastal field school approach by local NGO. So we did a, let's say, capacity building on, or enabling and empowering the local community. And I sometimes also teach in the coastal field schools. And we teach them how to do more sustainable and more environmental friendly aquaculture. And that works really well. The shrimp harvest from those are really big. It requires a little bit more input and initial investment, and the outcome and we're currently comparing, and the benefits are the same as with the intensive aquaculture.
Just a quick example, the publication I mentioned, CRIDA, one of the case studies, CRIDA has been in development for about 7 or 8 years, and that long lead time has allowed us to actually test implementation in many areas to be able to make adjustments to the methodologies that are in. One of the case studies that's my favorite actually in CRIDA is from northern Thailand, a city called Udon Thani. And there, in Thailand generally has a very kind of top-down oriented approach to infrastructure development. But in this case, we were working directly with a mayor of the city. There was a strong urban flooding component there. And this mayor had been really challenged to think about kind of hard infrastructure solutions. But one of the guiding ideas that I've really latched onto over the past few years is if you draw the number of people quite widely at the beginning of a process, you really engage a lot of stakeholders, and also you define your problem or the situation, the goals that you're trying to solve at a fairly broad level, then you'll come up with both broad solutions, and you'll build in support from the beginning. And in this case, this mayor, he's really served as the catalyst for applying CRIDA, and he heard from his constituents, from the members of the city, also from the sectors that were interacting with the city, agriculture and energy in particular, to actually go with a very strong green solution. They ended up going with a series of lakes that are being developed throughout the city. So it has some commonality with the sponge city concept and application. But I really like how that they really chose this strong sense that we need to choose exactly what our future is, that we have to live with it, and our city is changing quite rapidly, and we need to actually make sure that our city stays livable, and I like your phrase, stay lovable too. So, and economic components were a strong element of that, but they found that it was cost effective. So.
Cost effectiveness, I believe that we also have some points to make, maybe in the context of the next questions, because very often actually a green solution may cost even less than the gray ones. But of course, performance and other criteria may take us to gray and green combine, or gray solutions in some cases. But cost, I don't think, is the number one challenge. And maybe other challenges are also there. Any other question from the floor? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Diane Archer. I work at the Stockholm Environment Institute in Bangkok. Thank you very much for your presentations. I thought they were all fascinating. And actually, I have a project in Udon Thani looking at the health and well-being benefits of the public spaces, which are essentially the parks that have been built around the lakes. So that's a great example. I'll look into your book. I wanted to ask more about the opportunities for integrated approaches. So we know, for example, that green spaces, riversides offer health benefits. How for example, in the Filipino case, how are you trying to integrate different departments, for example, the waste management department, to ensure that there's also waste management systems so the rivers aren't blocked up with rubbish, or how to link up to the transport system so that people don't drive to the parks and so on? I'd just be interested to see whether that's been taken into consideration.
Excellent question. Possibly to see from both the institutional coordination viewpoint, maybe Julian, you already have the microphone, can say, but also from the decision making, maybe John, if you have something to say on these issues of cross-sectoral and cross-institutional coordination. Yes.
At this stage, we're primarily looking at designing of the site. So we try to zoom out and talk about, how are people going to get here? What jeepney lines do you have? Where's your tricycle station? Majority of the cities outside of Metro Manila don't have large public infrastructure, public transport projects yet. So it's mostly connectivity and accessibility and weaving that space into the surrounding area. But on a different project, which I didn't discuss, which is the Pasig River, that's something else that we're working on, is how to restore the ferry service on the Pasig. And that's been the catalyst of a larger conversation where you're talking with 5 different cities for the Pasig River, 2 additional ones as you go up Marikina, and regionally as you talk about Manila Bay and Laguna Bay. And that's something where we're looking at, you have to coordinate with 10 agencies. We have a convergence group of 10 agencies talking about how to harmonize all of the investments across those different departments to make sure that we are, to run a ferry, you need to make sure that the river is clean, that there's not a bunch of solid waste that is going to get trapped. There's water hyacinth blooms, there's dredging issues, which all extend from other issues of environmental management, wastewater treatment issues. We can't clean the river till, I think it's only 16% of Metro Manila has wastewater treatment. So, there's a lot of convergence of the various problems of Metro Manila symbolized in the river. We are tackling those. The way that we did it, instead of having to go about changing all the policies up front, which is going to take time, is we put together a technical working group. They joke in the Philippines that if you want to seem productive and seem like you're moving forward, you put together a TWG. But we're actually, I've found it to be a very effective mechanism to work across the agencies, put a vision and develop a roadmap, and just try to say, at least can we harmonize everything that we're doing towards a common plan, see what the gaps are, and then try to figure out what we need to get, to fill them. So it's tedious. It's really tedious. I go around talking to 10 agencies all the time, figuring out, following up, micromanaging. It's a lot of work, but I think, it's one way to go about it.
John, and also from the China experience, if you have anything to say maybe on this institutional or other questions later on. Yes, John, you wanted to say something?
Sure. Kind of a quick follow-up point, maybe. I see kind of 2 general points at which you have an opportunity to be really cross-sectoral. One is at the project scale, and the other one, for lack of a better term, kind of episodic or not opportunistic scale. That episodic scale is when you've defined a project and you try very hard right at the beginning to establish, as I mentioned earlier, a kind of broad circle of stakeholders, direct and indirect, and try to think very broadly about the problem that you're working on. Say it's a flood risk problem that you try to not think, well, in your problem statement that we're just looking at climate impacts from flood risk. Flood risk is extremely multifactorial. And because of that, and because it's going to change over time from many other elements, climate change being one, but probably many other drivers as well, you automatically need to bring in other ministries, other sectors, other kinds of institutions. And some of them may be local, some of them may be distant. But that's actually really important, and often it calls on the kind of the lead, often the very technical lead, to take on more of a governance function. And that is often a very particular challenge and a kind of a specialized area that you need additional support in. So that may be a particular gap. The episodic level, I think, is also really interesting. So I think some of the stories that you were telling about some of the projects in your presentation are really good examples where a project is initiated and immediately you begin to see that there are other functions, other systems that are beginning to interplay. Maybe the stormwater example that you used, there was a stormwater collection area, and we need to reoperate it, we need to update it, and suddenly you say, well, actually, there's an opportunity here to bring in a whole bunch of other co-benefits. So that's a good example. We might think of some administrative opportunities that come up. China, over the past year, for instance, completely revitalized and altered their whole water management administrative structure. Those kinds of institutional realignments also become episodes in which you can begin to think about other kinds of interleakages. And the last one I would say is when there's been a disaster or something bad that's happened. That often that kind of focuses attention. And that's often where you're particularly able to bring in political leadership to help kind of catalyze cross-sectoral integration.
So in a way, nature-based solutions and approaches lend themselves to even more challenges, but also opportunities to cross-institutionally link and coordinate, especially if there are multiple benefits arising of the various approaches that have been invested in, or even in terms of flexibility, and adaptive management that was mentioned earlier, because we have green type of options which themselves are more flexible than the gray one, are less rigid, and therefore, again, a need to realign. You use the word realign, which again may call for institutional cross-coordination type of effort. So definitely a tedious work, as you said, Julia, but also something which allows us to get possibly more and better coordination if the system is basically has to be optimized. Any other point or any other questions? Yes, we have a lot of questions then. Yes, and then second and third. We still have maybe 5-10 minutes.
Hi, I'm Prati from ADB, consultant with ADB. I have a question to Kenneth. You talked about this northern, southern river system to be connected to northern dry areas in China. So do you think it will be against the nature? And the second question again is like, if it all this to be done, how are we going to maintain this as a green infrastructure rather than a gray?
Yeah, so the water scarcity issue in China is definitely an issue that cannot be resolved by a single project. In the past, there has been so many so-called hard infrastructure. Probably gray is not the right color, it's a black color actually. So it's very, very engineering solutions, the three-quarters dam and the south to north transfer scheme. I think it's only recently that the government finds out that this mega solution is not resolving all of its issue, and it's got a lot of associated social and other impacts. And that's why this smart city come into play recently, which is seen as a solution that work with the nature. So I very much think the green working together with the gray is the way forward, because to be honest, the green solution in itself is not going to resolve your problem either. You know, it would be good to store and collect the rainfall and use it for some sort of supply. But because of the unique population and the population density in China, I think the hard engineering solution is still needed. The very uneven rainfall distribution. But I think the whole concept of a sponge city is to, you know, be implemented within the city, principally at the new development areas, which will eventually go into the existing built areas. So very much the hard infrastructure is still needed to support your core operation of your existing development while diversifying your risk, your resilience, you know, as you grow as a city. So I think the two have to work hand in hand.
Yeah, so I think it's Mark Fletcher from Arup. I think as we look to increasingly taking account of social benefits, social capital and natural benefits, or the natural capital, we find in that grey-green option, green, it scores hands down. It's really powerful. One of the dangers, I'd say, to be aware of is just promoting a grey-green, and as I travel around the world, we try and make it grey-green-blue, is making sure metropolitan water, or the role of sanitation or water quality or water treatment, is considered in the round. Because I think there's a lot more we can do by looking across the whole catchment or basement or basin, where green can have a role in taking either the pressure off the blue space, and if we're not careful, just promoting this as green can be perceived as putting us in the corner just with the, you know, the hair shirts and an extreme perspective. So my suggestion is that we think sort of grey, green, blue, whatever works best, and that as we broaden our ability to understand social and natural benefits more, I think we'll find that we'll be shifting in this direction. It's a natural move.
Thanks.
Particularly for
Maybe
passive
Stefano,
solutions.
you haven't yet talk in your experience.
Yeah, I think this
catchment.
was more common, not really a question, and of course we fully support that. I think when we or at least me, when I talk about green, it includes the blue. So that's why I don't. I even used green and blue letters to show that. But I think I wanna talk about this institutional thing a bit more, because I think it's really important. In China, of course, you have very strong government and governance structures and systems, and top down works very, very well, but across doesn't work so well. They don't really like to talk to each other on all levels of government. And I think now they have just, John just mentioned that they have restructured their ministries a little bit just recently. And I think we hope that through this, as it will also trickle down to the local government levels, that this will sort of solve some of these issues that we have by, like the Water Affairs Bureau on the local level is responsible for the amounts of water, so for flooding, and the idea is to put all the water in the pipe and let it go away fast. That's the best. And then you have the Environmental Protection Bureau that's responsible for the quality of the water. So completely separated, and they also don't like to talk to each other. So at least, the nice thing about us, when we come from ADB, so every time I go on a mission, I request meetings with all the different local administrative departments, and often case that's the only time they actually meet. So sometimes I just sit back and let them talk because they never meet. But I think this is really very important. And when we talk about climate change, I think some of the cities in China have started to create offices directly under the mayor for climate change, to tackle climate change issues. And I think this is a quite strong institutional arrangement.
Your point brought up something for me. I think an angle that I'm interested to see about this whole discussion is how also the green infrastructure helps for cities who are already highly built up during this meeting, we probably already have a whole new town that's sprouted somewhere outside in the periphery of Metro Manila that's not linked to sewage, that's not linked to the system. And are we going to be able to dig up the whole town and put in the great infrastructure that we need at this point? And we're not the only cities like this. Across the global south, cities are just growing with no regulation and they're just happening on their own. So what's also the role for green infrastructure to be that sort of immediate solution to combat some of those things in the immediate term, while we have to wait, or maybe we're never going to get to the chance to put in that, great infrastructure at that master plan scale.
We have time for one more questions from this area. Yes.
I am Balz Tribunalo from Cebu Province. I'm working with the Provincial Disasters Management. Build and build, green and green, and sometimes break and break. I am saying this because there are lots of opportunities of putting the green component of the existing infrastructure, especially in my province. But I think maybe others can also add how you can add the social component, especially the one that was raised a while ago, the people's consultation. I think there is a kind of cultural sensitivity in terms of the green component of the project, especially when you think about culture, when you think about the historicity, at the same time, the future development in a particular area. So agencies, yes, but people centered process, I think, will really matter. Thank you, ma'am.
When we are talking about multiple streams of benefits, we can even include, you mentioned history, you mentioned the local communities, and possibly the other social aspects like job creation and opportunities, maybe also from the tourism sector development in some areas. So green solutions have all of these potential benefits. Anybody would like to add on this, either from project experience or, yes, Julia, yeah.
I mean, quickly, I'll just say that, the participation question comes up a lot. And of course, to make it sustainable on a lot of aspects, including even the maintenance. You mentioned about, it's maintenance should be the other point of that. And the citizens are the watchdogs that would see every day whether or not the plants are being watered, whether or not the project is being implemented. So we want to make sure on our side, we can really focus on transparency. So at the end of November, there will be a website that lists every single investment, every single project, and hopefully we've made a big media effort to try to get more people involved next year for the next round of funding to propose to their local governments. At the end of the day, we only get the proposal from the mayor. So it needs to be, and that public participation in the Philippines can be quite low. So have you been to your barangay assembly? Have you proposed a project to your councilor? That's the level where decisions are also made in terms of what we see at the end of the day from the mayor. So we want to figure out some ways to also try to encourage more public participation on the conceptualization of the project to make sure this is also what people really want. So that's something that we're also trying to work on. But that's kind of our avenue in terms of where DBM can come in.
Yeah, maybe to add to it a little bit from a more other country perspective also, I think I see a bit of a societal change in it. So often when I come in, people have already been asking for green solutions, or in the Netherlands even have been opposing to gray infrastructure. And in the US also you see that. You see that people, so in the Netherlands, for example, people don't want a very big, while it's meant to keep them safe, they don't want a very big levee in front of their house. And then they actually start asking for a greener solution to keep the levee lower and to actually get more floodplain in front of the levee, for example. So the big implementations of nature-based that I've seen in the Netherlands are definitely bottom-up generated because of resistance by people to hard infrastructure.
Thank you. I think that the time is over, and I wanted to thank not only the panelists but all the audience for the rich discussion. It's work in progress. I think we are moving in the right direction, and we are making good progress in many ways. So thank you very much to all of you and the panelists for coming over. Thanks.
I'd be happy to. Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah, safe travels. I'm John.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to learn more about what you did in Scotland.
Absolutely.
I don't know if it was the same mayor as sorry.
No, it feels very
Currently
strange.
in place, apparently.
I promise not to propose.
Apparently, it's coming to the end of his term soon, or there's going to be elections soon. But I was at the municipality last week, having meetings with them about projects. So it would be really great to hear more what applicants you had and so on.
Yeah, I'm in very regular contact with the guy who's the lead of that project. It was supported in part by
Yeah. Oh, the US, yeah.
USA.
That's helpful. Yeah, I'm trying to look. I'm trying to look for the website that you're referring to. Yeah.
Where do you mostly work?
Oh, work across. I mean, my work at least, but we're actually in several countries across the world. So, so the lessons here we can share with all the countries that we work in. Yeah.